Okay, welcome to part one of the history of Jerusalem, Israel, and the Jewish people. And let me just say, this is a series of teachings we're doing really on history, also kind of talking a little bit about the culture and society of modern day Israel. There's going to be 8 sessions. They're going to be roughly about 30 minutes apart. I mean, some could be 35, some could be 25 minutes, but I'm trying to keep it right around 30 minutes. And the purpose of this series is to prepare people for going to Israel, and especially with Emmanuel Fellowship. It's Israel and Jerusalem is so complex, and it's been around since the very beginning of time, and it's probably the one place in the world where things have been recorded all throughout history, and it's also a place where almost everybody has had a part in controlling what's now known as Israel. At least within Western civilization. They say that Jerusalem has been sieged more than any other city in the history of the world. It's been conquered more than any other city in the history of the world. It's been rebuilt, torn down and rebuilt more than any other city in the history of the world. And it's also been controlled or ruled by more people than any other city in the history of the world. And that's in spite of the fact that Jerusalem literally means city of peace. But in order to understand Israel, and really to understand even a lot of what's going to be happening and unfolding in the history, in history and what God's purpose is, we really need to understand a little bit of the history. Now, of course, I cannot go over every aspect of the history of Israel. I have studied quite a bit. There's a lot of areas I'm stronger in than others. But this is really just an overview, and an overview that will help design or help prepare you to go to Israel, because you're going to see, you could go to different places and they're going to say, now during the Byzantine period, or during the Hellenistic period, or during whatever, at least you're not kind of thinking, I don't even have any idea what they're talking about. So we're at least going to be able to go through the chronological history of Israel. We're going to spend a little bit more time talking about what's happened in the last 100 years, because it's very important for just world politics, for what's going on, and most important for what God's doing. So anyway, now one of the things I am going to do is I'm going to mention different books, and I'm going to mention different movies that you may want to look at on your own. And probably especially movies, it's not a big investment of time. Actually, one book that I would highly recommend is called Jerusalem, and it's the biography, and I've read it twice. It's got, it's got a lot of pages to it, over 600 pages. But, that's one book you may want to consider reading. But I'm going to actually talk about a lot of other shorter books, and also some movies, like I said. So anyway, so we're going to be doing this pretty much in 7 sessions, and then the last session, I want to talk about why is Israel so important, especially as it pertains to today and pertains to God's purposes. And I think that will really sort of tie it all together. But I think understanding the history will make that a much more richer session. Okay, so I'm going to start off by, let's look at some of the geography of Israel. And we're going to take a look at a map here. Okay, this is a topographical map of the land of Israel. And I think it's just important to kind of see sort of where everything is. This is in Spanish. I couldn't find my English copy, but I can tell you this is the Mediterranean Sea. This is primarily the land of Israel, although it does kind of go down here. The Mediterranean Sea, the Dead Sea, and the Sea of Galilee are the 3 biggest points of interest. And connecting the Sea of Galilee to the Dead Sea is the Jordan River. Along the coastline, this is, except for right around here where present-day Haifa is, and there's a mountain called Mount Carmel, and this is, but basically this is kind of plains right here. It's Israel today is I mean, there's all sorts of, orange trees, all sorts of fruits, vegetables kind of grown here. Then, as you can see, it kind of goes up into kind of a mountainous area. Up here, we kind of come to, right here is Jerusalem, and it's located about 2,600 feet above sea level. And that's the old city. There's some parts of Israel, they're probably a little bit higher. Okay, if you go up this way and cross over, you kind of climb in elevation, and then you go down to the Sea of Galilee. In fact, the Sea of Galilee is actually below sea level. It's 686 feet below sea level. And the Jordan River flows out of the Sea of Galilee down to the Dead Sea, and the Dead Sea is at about 1,400 feet below sea level. It is actually the lowest place in the world. In fact, I kind of joke when we go down to visit the Dead Sea, I kind of say, well, this is going to be the low point of our trip. And it really is literally the low point. So the Dead Sea, nothing flows out of it because it's the lowest place in the world. And because of that, it just becomes stagnant. And over the centuries and centuries, it's earned the reputation of the Dead Sea. It's salty, lots of chemicals, minerals. Actually, people like to bathe in it because of that. But it does not support any life. So going from from the Dead Sea to Jerusalem, you might notice that the Bible sometimes says we went up to Jerusalem, because you're going from 1,400 feet to about 26. You're going about 4,000 feet above sea level in a period of about 15 miles. You can go from Tel Aviv, which is about right here, to the Sea of Galilee in about 2 hours. You can take the bullet train from Tel Aviv airport to downtown Jerusalem, and that takes about 18 minutes, 19 minutes at the very most. So you can see this is not, this is a very small country. So anyway, I think this probably kind of gives you the idea. Maybe I should also kind of say, as you go up this way from the Sea of Galilee, it stays below sea level for a little bit, and then it begins to climb on both sides. And so you have, let's say, like Mount Hermon, which is the highest point in Israel. It's about 9,000 feet above sea level, and it's got snow in it for about 3 or 4 months of the year. Okay, so I'll probably be referring to other parts of geography. At least you have some idea of, how Israel is laid out there. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the history of Israel. And we're going to do, out of the 4,000 years of history in Israel, we could cover about 2,000 of them right now. A lot of it because we're going through the scriptures. I assume that most people who are listening to this are somewhat familiar with the history of Israel. But when was the first time Jerusalem was actually referred to in the scriptures? This is not in the scriptures, but Jewish tradition says, and it's pretty deeply rooted, that the Garden of Eden was really in Jerusalem at what is now known as Mount Zion. So, at least according to Jewish history, from the very beginning, Jerusalem was at least referred to. You go to Genesis 22, and Abraham is called to sacrifice his son Isaac. And of course, God jumps in and intervenes. And you can read about this in Genesis 22. And he is instructed by God to go to the land north of there and to the place called Mount Moriah. And that is where Isaac was to be sacrificed. Now, we know now that Mount Moriah is exactly where Mount Zion is. And the significance of that, of course, is that Abraham was going to sacrifice his own son. God intervened, and then You remember the story, Abraham sees this lamb stuck in the thickets, and he takes that and sacrifices it there on Mount Moriah. And God said to call this place Jehovah Jireh, which means the Lord will provide. He'll provide a sacrificed lamb one day that was going to be for all people. That's all that happened about 2,000 years before Christ. Okay, Genesis 22. You go to another 1,000 years, the children of Israel have come into the land of Canaan. They've settled it. They've had a number of judges. Saul was named king, and after Saul, David took over. And King David conquered what was called Jerusalem, but what is Jerusalem, from the Jebusites. And he established it because it was kind of up in the mountains, kind of, looking down at different places, as the capital of his kingdom. Now that was kind of a little unusual because it's not like there's any rivers flowing through, Jerusalem, but there were a lot of springs coming up from, the area around Jerusalem. And so it was established as the capital of Israel. David brings back the tabernacle that had been missing for a long time and plants it on Mount Zion, which is, back then, Mount Zion was a hill overlooking the old town of Jerusalem. Now, of course, Jerusalem encompasses the whole area, including Mount Zion. And this was the first permanent place for the house of God. It was called the Tabernacle of David. And this hill was called Zion. In fact, there's a lot of Psalms, there's a lot of references. The prophets talk about Zion. And Zion, in the most narrow sense, referred to this mountain. It also referred to Jerusalem, and in some cases it actually refers to all of Israel. And in some cases it actually refers to God's people, which is around the world. So anyway, that was the next thing that we kind of see as far as the history of Israel. Now Solomon, his son, took over, and Solomon was instructed to build a temple. And he did it where the tabernacle was, on Mount Zion. And this first temple was called, Solomon's temple was called the first temple. And that's the way archaeologists refer to it today. And it was an amazing structure. You remember that Queen Sheba from Africa came in, and she fainted as she was kind of going up the steps to it, because it was so, at least back then, it was so magnificent. And so this, we're probably talking about 970, 900 to 931 BC is when Solomon was alive. So that kind of gives you some idea of, basically the temple was built probably about 970 BC. Okay, then, of course, because of Israel's disobedience and all that, the temple was destroyed by whom? It was destroyed by the Babylonians, and the date there is 587. So I'm just kind of giving you a quick timeline here. And after that, there was the Jews were brought into captivity in Babylon, and to be honest, most of them kind of got jobs. They bought land, they settled down, and most of them kind of stayed. But after about 70 years, according to the prophetic words, some of the Jews started going back. And going home was, it was a remnant only, and that happened between 538 and 520 BC. So there's a period of time. And one of the things they do is they rebuild the temple, they rebuild the walls. This is in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. And when they rebuilt the temple, that was called the Second Temple, because the first temple had been totally destroyed, right? Now, during the time of Babylon, maybe just kind of back up a little bit, Babylon was in charge of that part of the world, and they had dominated. And then after that, the Medes took over, and after that, the Persians took over. So Israel, or the land of what we call now Israel, was occupied, or at least controlled, by the Babylonians, before that the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Medes, the Persians. So they go home, and part of the reasoning of the governing the Medes and the Persians is that, well, let them have their own land and let them kind of do what they would like to do, and they will, we'll still be in control, but we'll give them some sense of autonomy. Okay, so let's fast forward to the 300s, and there's a man that most of us have heard in history, Alexander the Great. And he was from Greece. He was Greek. And by the way, some of Daniel's prophecies actually talk about this. They describe him as a goat with a big horn. He comes crashing in and destroys everything. And he did. He took over the world in a short amount of time. In fact, he died when he was 33 years old. So, and when Alexander died, 4 generals divided the kingdom. And we won't kind of go into what all 4 of them were, but the one that included Syria, Judah, Jerusalem was called the Seleucid Empire. And they kind of ruled Jerusalem and the land of Judea. Now, when I say kind of, it was kind of like the Persians and some of the others. As long as, these areas paid their taxes, they were permitted to kind of pretty much live like they wanted. Now, the Greek period of Western civilization is often called the Hellenistic period of history, because for several hundred years, the Greeks imposed their language. They made it sort of the trade language. In fact, Greek was so well entrenched into the peoples of the Mediterranean area that even after Rome took over, they kept the Greek language as sort of the trade language. And there's also Greek culture. And there was there were some of the Jews in Jerusalem and in Israel that were quite fascinated with Greek culture and how it, and just, the philosophies, and it sort of took them away from, worshiping God. On the other hand, there are some Jews that were very insistent. No, God's called us to be a special nation. We need to kind of remain true to the Torah, to the scriptures. Well, there's a man who rose to control the Seleucid Empire called Antiochus IV Epiphanes. And you can see his birth date is 215. He lived to 164 BC. And during his reign, there was a squabble in Jerusalem on who was going to be the high priest. And so Antiochus decided, well, you know what? We can't have squabbles. He's just going to kind of come in and just kind of settle it himself. And so Antiochus attacks Jerusalem in 168 BC. Now, that was about 4 years before he died. And he desecrates the temple. I mean, he actually sacrifices a pig in the middle of the temple to the Zeus god. He forbid the reading of the Torah. He banned all worship of God. He banned circumcision, which was a big thing for the Jews at that time. And like I said, he desecrated the temple. Well, that got the more patriotic Jews really fired up. And I'm not going to go into all the details, but it resulted in the Maccabean revolt. And the Maccabeans were a family. They gained a lot of support, and they ended up retaking Jerusalem and rededicating the temple. Now, they retook Jerusalem not necessarily because Greece was so weak, but Antiochus IV died about 4 years later, and so there just wasn't the will of the new ruler of the Seleucid Empire to really impose his will, and to him it didn't really make a lot of sense. Why should we kind of forbid worship there? Let's let them kind of do what they want to do. And so, but anyway, the Maccabean revolt there is a lot of, and there's assassinations, and some people kind of feel like they sort of invented guerrilla warfare, and and their attacks on the Greeks. And of course, the festival of Hanukkah is a reminder of when they retook Jerusalem, and it's sometimes called the Festival of Lights, because one of the things they did, they looked around to try to light the menorah when they rededicated the temple with oil, and there's only just a little bit of oil that had been not contaminated by the Greeks. And so supposedly this menorah lasted with a little bit of oil for 8 days, and until they had time to kind of bring some other oil that they could dedicate and purify, and then, keep the menorah kind of going, there in the temple. So Hanukkah is how we celebrate that. Okay, by the way, there's a lot of martyrs, there's a lot of stories, really a fascinating period of Jewish history. Okay, let's kind of jump down to in 63 BC, so we've gone almost 2,000 years already. The Roman government, Roman Empire takes control of Syria. Now again, there's still a lot of Hellenistic influence, such as the language. In fact, Jesus, the New Testament was written in Greek, and Jesus, he spoke Hebrew, but he also spoke Greek. In fact, a lot of his teachings were in Greek, because that was really the common language. And then in 40 BC, Herod is made king of the Jews by Rome. Now, this is the way Rome operated. When they would conquer someone, they would find someone who could be kind of like a puppet king or a puppet ruler to rule over, that country. And they would promise, military support, but of course, they wanted their taxes and everything. And if there was a revolt, it's for sure the Roman army would kind of come in. Well, King Herod, there's several King Herods. This is Herod the Great, and he lived to about 4 BC, actually right after Jesus died, and after Jesus was born, I'm sorry. And it was during his reign that Rome gains military control over Jerusalem and Judea, because there was always a lot of resistance in Judea to a foreign occupation, and you can see why. And so anyway, Herod the Great, he was actually one of the richest people in the world. In fact, some people say that he was the richest, even more than Caesar. And part of it is because Israel, Jerusalem, where Judea was sort of at the crossroads of a lot of trade routes. And Herod was able to make a lot of money. And there's 3 building projects that he did that if he had only built one of them, it would probably mark his name in history, but he did 3 of them. And there's remnants of all 3 even there today. One, of course, is he expanded the second temple. I mean, he doubled, tripled it. I mean, he made it a place. I mean, some people, it was more magnificent than any place in Rome, they said. And people loved going there. And of course, he did kind of build it on, kind of, it was a lot of it involved, a lot of corruption. I don't want to kind of go into all that right now. But anyway, that was his, one of his big projects. The second thing he did was he built a port city from scratch along the Mediterranean. It's up between Tel Aviv, present-day Tel Aviv, and Haifa, and it was called Caesarea. He kind of honored, Caesar. He made it a port. In other words, he actually kind of out into the Mediterranean. He kind of big concrete, passageways. He had a Colosseum there. He had a place for chariot races. And by the way, the ruins of that city are still there. And depending on the trip that you're involved in with us, we could go there. It's a fascinating place. And then the third big thing that he did because he was so paranoid. I mean, he was so paranoid. He had his wife killed at one time. One of his wives. He had a couple of his sons killed because he felt like they could try to take over. But he was very paranoid. He was very insecure, and which often happens when someone has a lot of power, because you've got a lot to lose. And so by the Dead Sea, there's this mountain or this mount that kind of went up, and he built a fortress called Masada on top of it. And this Masada had two palaces. It had cisterns for storing water. It had places to store food, and basically he had water and food stored there that if he had to, he could just kind of go there, and no one could reach him being up there, and he could live the rest of his life and have food and water and everything. A fascinating place. And we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But all three of those, and the ruins of that are still there too. But on the other hand, even though he was a great builder, Herod was insecure, he was greedy, some people called him the king of corruption. That's where he made a lot of his money. And sadly, he died a very horrible death of just this bacteria that was just eating his flesh. And it happened right after he went after all the children in Bethlehem. Okay, so then there's Jesus' life, which I'm not even going to talk about at all because it's not, you've got the scriptures. I would recommend that if you're going to Israel, that you try to read through the Gospels 3 or 4 months ahead of time, because that will be probably, at least our trips, that will be our focus, is looking where Jesus taught, where he did his miracles, where he discipled people. So after Jesus' death, the church in Jerusalem, it started in Jerusalem, and that's where, you remember in the book of Acts, many people from other nations were there, all Jews, because the diaspora, what we call the diaspora, was the Jews. About half the Jews in the world actually lived outside of Judea, in Rome and all these various Mediterranean, or Roman cities. And there were pockets, and they would always go to Jerusalem once or twice a year, or maybe every several years, depending on how much money they had. So the church started in Jerusalem, and then we know in the book of Acts it kind of went to the rest of Samaria and Judea, and then it started going to the rest of the world. Now in 70 AD, something happens that Jesus foretold in Matthew 24. He talked about this on his discourse at the Mount of Olives. His disciples were asking, when are you coming back, and how is this going to happen? And they were kind of pointing out, because from the Mount of Olives you could look out on this beautiful, grand second temple, and they were kind of saying, isn't it beautiful? And Jesus says, truly I tell you that before this generation is over, it's going to be destroyed, and there's not going to be one stone left upon another. And that's exactly what happened in 70 AD. There was a revolt by the Jews that was crushed by the Romans. And that great revolt was 66 to 73 AD. And the city was sieged, it was burned, the temple was destroyed. All that's left right now are some of the foundation walls, one of which is very famous. It's called the Wailing Wall. Some of the more some of the Jews actually went to Masada, and they climbed up there, and they made that a stronghold. And one of the last things that Rome did was attack Masada, and it took them months to conquer Masada. And in fact, I'll recommend my first movie, Masada. It's a 2-part, probably 3.5, 4 hours. Of course, it's a Hollywood version. They've got to put some romance in it and things like that. But it definitely tells the story of the Siege of Masada. Very interesting. The Romans, because of their pride, they wanted to conquer it. and they ended up having to they built a ramp of dirt up one of the sides to try to get in there. And then when they got in there, they all took their life just hours before the Romans got in. And even today, when Israel, you probably know this, but every woman and man has to spend 3 years, women 2 years, in the military. And so after they go through their basic training, they take them up to Masada, and they and tell the story again. Of course, they've heard it many, many times of how they did not give up. They'd rather die than be taken as slaves. In fact, the motto even today in Israel is never again. And of course, referring primarily to the Holocaust, but throughout the history where they've just been persecuted and almost destroyed so many times. So Masada is a very important place. We will be going up there. And again, there's a lot of drama, a lot of interesting, side stories about this that you can, that we'll talk about once we get there. So the fall of Jerusalem and Israel was horrible. It was bloody. Many, many people died. But the result was that most of the Jews, not all of them, but most of them were scattered or sold as slaves. Now, you have to kind of remember in the Roman Empire, the slaves, they had laws that you could only have a slave for, it kind of changed throughout history, but let's say like 20 years. And then after that, you had to give them their freedom. And their children, unlike maybe slavery, in more modern times, like here in the United States and other places. But the result was that everyone scattered, most everyone. And it was also the end of the temple, the sacrifice system. Much of the Jewish life was really destroyed. And we're going to pick up next time on what happens after that. But I do want to mention one other important part of what was happening before Jesus is born, probably 250, 300 years before. There was a group of dedicated Jews who were tired of the corruption in Jerusalem. And they were looking forward to the Messiah coming. And they were called the Essenes. And they formed a community. It was actually men only. And they, a fascinating thing. And they existed for several hundred years. And their community was called Qumran. The ruins are still there. And it was near the Dead Sea. And probably there's a lot of good evidence that John the Baptist, before he started his ministry, was one of the Essenes. And one of the things they did, they had these cisterns of fresh water every day. They would baptize one another to kind of cleanse themselves. And one of the things they did is they had a very strict community life, but everyone had to write out the scriptures for several hours of the day. And so they had hundreds and hundreds of copies of the scriptures, and and that they were preserving. Well, when the Romans came in, they knew they were going to be killed. They knew they were going to be destroyed. But their work, their legacy were these scriptures. And so they put them in scrolls, they put them in, big clay jars and sealed them, and then they hid them in a lot of the caves around Qumran. And we'll pick this up later, but basically they were there until 1947, 1948, 1949, when all of a sudden these scrolls were discovered, and that's the Dead Sea Scrolls. And very important, probably one of the most remarkable archaeological discoveries ever. And when we get there, I'm going to tell you why. I just want to kind of mention that right now. Okay, so let's kind of end there, and then we'll pick up in session 2 next week. Thanks.